This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
Welcome back, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at the End of History podcast, where we help believers make sense of the chaotic world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that helped shape these times. Now, we are continuing our current podcast series, The Empire, a 250-year American story. Today's episode is a little different. We're going to look behind the narrative of the history and at one of the key ideas that came after the Civil War. Growing up in the South, personally, the idea of the Civil War, it's really different from what outsiders might expect. It's only when you step out and look back at your upbringing, look back at the worldviews and the perceptions that you took for granted, that you begin to realize how bizarre it was. We were the South. We were the side that lost the war. We were the side that got invaded by the North. We were the side that had to rebuild, right? And then you start to think, what's all this we stuff about? I've never been pro-slavery or even pro-secession or anything like that. And yet, having been born and raised in the South, there's this very strong sense of identity with the region. And honestly, it doesn't make a lot of sense. When I was young, I had a shirt that read, American by birth, Southern by the grace of God. All right. That was a typical thing you would see in the region that I grew up in. That sentiment, even that shirt, those bumper stickers. I remember hearing and enjoying a famous song by Hank Williams Jr. called "If the South Would Have Won, We'd Have Had It Made." And thoughts like this exist totally separate from historical realities. I mean, when you stop and think about it, obviously I wouldn't have wanted the South to have won the Civil War. I wouldn't have wanted slavery to perpetuate. I honestly don't think America would really even exist today if the South would have won the war. But these are the thoughts. These are the perceptions and a weirdly inherited worldview that sits ever so naturally in your head when you're born and raised in the southern United States. Ulysses S. Grant was a drunk. Robert E. Lee was a gentleman. The North was industrial. The South was fighting for their homeland. And there's this feeling that we, the Southerners, got betrayed, got cheated, despite our honor in the Civil War. The mid-20th century writer, William Faulkner, he wrote things like Absalom. William Faulkner. He hailed from Mississippi, okay? He once wrote, this was a line from one of his books, he says, "For every Southern boy 14 years old, not once but whenever he wants it, there is the instant when it's still not yet 2 o'clock on that July afternoon in 1863. What he's talking about there is the moment of Pickett's charge that we looked at in an earlier episode. And he's doing it in a way that truly, genuinely resonates with every young Southern man I know of, even if they don't realize what they're actually really thinking about. Faulkner was referring to Pickett's charge at Gettysburg and how things might have gone differently that day, and for the war after that, if Pickett had succeeded in his charge at Gettysburg at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, July 1863. Closer to my own time, there's a song from the country music poet Don Williams. It's called "Good Old Boys Like Me." It's a beautiful song. The first line of the song goes, "When I was a kid, Uncle Remus would put me to bed with a picture of Stonewall Jackson above my head. Then Daddy came in to kiss his little man with gin on his breath and a Bible in his hand. He talked about honor and things I should know. Then he staggered a little as he went out the door." Now, the whole song is great, but that line right there, it captures the same sentiment that Faulkner was talking about. It's a lost honor, a defeated honor. It's the lost cause and something that people in the South look back to, and it's connected to Stonewall Jackson. It's connected to Robert E. Lee and the whole bloody affair. Most folks in the South, they probably couldn't tell you the date the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor or the date of when either of the world wars ended. But they can tell you all sorts of things, trivia and minutia about the Civil War, because that's our heritage. That's why people get upset about Confederate flags and monuments being removed, even if they aren't really thinking that much about the facts of it all. The idea is the lost cause, and it's incredibly real and powerful in the South. And I honestly have a hard time explaining why that is, just to be real clear. I can trace the history, though. And once you start tracing the history, the error of the idea starts to stick out. It is a myth, but it's a powerful myth. And in its power, the truth gets buried. And I think well-meaning people miss the dangers of what they're holding on to here. As Reconstruction collapsed after the Civil War, many former Confederates, they needed an explanation for their defeat. The answer they developed became known as the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause portrayed the Confederacy as noble, as honorable. It claimed Southern soldiers had fought primarily for states' rights, for local self-government, for constitutional liberty. Slavery, that issue, that was minimized. It was ignored. It was even treated at best as a secondary issue. To this day, when you hear statements and arguments that the Civil War was about state rights, it's just not true. You'll hear people refer, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but there's also some seriousness to it, as the Northern War of Aggression. People in the South, that's what they'll call the Civil War. This is all a byproduct of the Lost Cause myth. And believe it or not, it was deliberately manufactured. According to this interpretation, the South lost only because the North possessed greater manpower and industrial resources. There's some truth to that. But when people from the South think of the South's leaders during the Civil War, they don't think of Jefferson Davis. They don't think of Alexander Stephens, the president and vice president. They think of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. The politicians lost the war. The noble and honorable generals, they fought for the cause until they couldn't fight anymore. The Lost Cause, it elevated leaders into legendary figures. Robert E. Lee became the embodiment of honor, of duty, even of Christian virtue. His flaws, his political beliefs were downplayed. His decision to fight for the Confederacy was portrayed as an act of tragic loyalty rather than a defense of a slave-holding republic. There's a famous biography of Robert E. Lee written in the 1970s. It's called The Marble Man, and it's a good title. It's about the image of Lee, the image we look at when we consider Lee, but it's also about the enormous amount of statues, marble statues that persist across the South of Robert E. Lee. It's like he became a saint in the southern United States. He lived only 5 more years after the Civil War, died of heart disease in 1870. But time after time, he posed for photos in those 5 years. And these photos became the basis for these great statues and monuments across the South. I read one book that suggested if George Washington had lost the Revolutionary War, he would have been like Robert E. Lee. That would have been his fate. And maybe there would have been a lost cause that attached itself to George Washington. I don't really think that's true. If Washington had lost the war in the American Revolution, he probably would have been executed for high treason, since he was seen as the leader of a rebellion. Somehow, though, Robert E. Lee became the figurehead of a rebellion that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans and still became the patron saint of the South. He died at a university that he was recruited to and became its president after the war. It's kind of bizarre. The South doesn't see him as a traitor, but as the embodiment of honor and dignity. And all of this exists right alongside a Southern culture that is incredibly patriotic to the American flag and America in general today. Second to Lee, of course, is Stonewall Jackson. He became this symbol of courage, faith, sacrifice. If you ever drive through Lexington, Virginia, there's signs, it'll show you the way, but you can stop at the chapel and see Jackson's burial spot. When you go in that chapel, I'm curious what you'll think of it, because it's like this tomb of great honor, whispering echoes, because you whisper when you go in. You just know you're supposed to. It's downright reverential. This mythology of Lee and Jackson and the Lost Cause, it's empowered by monuments, empowered by photos, by the reframing of stories, and it was built deliberately. Organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, they promoted these images through monuments, through school textbooks, ceremonies, public commemoration throughout the second half of the 19th century after the Civil War. Among the most effective in propagating this lost cause myth was a lady by the name of Mildred L. Rutherford. She was born in 1851. She was a Georgia educator, a writer, a lecturer, and one of the most influential promoters of the Confederate lost cause. When she was born, her family was wealthy. They were a slaveholding family in Athens, Georgia. She graduated from the Lucy Cobb Institute, later served for many years as its principal there at that institution. And she also became a prominent leader of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. She served as its president, the Georgia division at least, from 1899 to 1902, and as the national organization's historian general from 1911 to 1916. The World War I years. She used education, publishing, public speaking to reshape popular memory of the Civil War. In books and pamphlets, lectures, and her own magazine, she portrayed the antebellum South, before the war South, as orderly and benevolent. She defended slavery, she celebrated Confederate leaders, and she argued that secession was actually constitutional. She minimized slavery's central role in causing the war, and she described the Confederacy as fighting nobly for states' rights and self-government. But her greatest influence came through the schools. And this is the little bit of history we often don't hear about. In her 1919 pamphlet, A Measuring Rod to Test Textbooks and Reference Books, this lady, Mildred Rutherford, she supplied criteria for judging textbooks according to their treatment of slavery and secession, Reconstruction, and Confederate figures. The UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, they used these standards to pressure schools and libraries, especially in the South, to reject work deemed hostile to the South and adopt sympathetic perspectives. So by directing what children read, Rutherford helped embed this lost cause mythology in American education and public memory for generations. I'd say even up to the present. I find her story terribly interesting because we see this happening in our own generation as activists on the left and the right side of the political spectrum copy Rutherford's tactics to spread their own version of history through schools. And by the way, if you only think the other side is doing this, you're probably not paying close enough attention. Both sides are doing this. Right alongside this movement in the education system of the South, there was a great boom of Confederate monuments being built also around the 1890s. Earlier memorials were usually placed in cemeteries. They primarily focused and mourned soldiers. But by the 1890s, monuments increasingly appeared in courthouse squares and state capitals. Along with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the United Confederate Veterans, they also raised money. They organized ceremonies. They promoted statues honoring Confederate generals and soldiers. Now, this timing was significant. Reconstruction had ended. White Democratic governments had regained control of the South by this point. States were imposing Jim Crow segregation and disenfranchising black citizens. So these monument dedications gathered white audiences for speeches presenting Confederate soldiers as heroic defenders of home, of liberty, of states' rights. They rarely acknowledged that protecting slavery was central to secession and the Confederate project. Instead, speakers talked about the antebellum South as a harmonious, this beautiful utopia. Slavery was benign, and Confederate defeat was the result of overwhelming Northern resources rather than an unjust cause. Because these monuments occupied authoritative public spaces like courthouses, like City Hall, they made this selective story appear permanent, made it appear official and approved. Children encountered it on courthouse lawns. Communities repeated it through ceremonies, newspapers, school lessons, veterans, and reunions. Statues like these transformed the lost cause from an argument in books and speeches into everyday civic landscape. And the most popular of these statues, they always featured General Robert E. Lee atop his horse. The monuments, therefore, They did more than just commemorate the dead. They helped legitimize the new racial order by connecting Jim Crow governments to an idealized Confederate past, because Jim Crow was now becoming the law of the land in the 1890s. Their visibility elevated white Southern memory while excluding enslaved people, black unionists, and emancipation, and it gave the Lost Cause mythology this public authority for generations. The Lost Cause depended upon changing public memory. This was difficult because Confederate leaders themselves had been remarkably clear about why they succeeded. I've quoted this in earlier episodes. Mississippi declared that its position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. Confederate Vice President Alexander H. Stephens openly stated that the Confederacy rested on the belief that black people were not equal to white people. But over time, these statements like them, faded from public memory. Textbooks began describing the Civil War primarily as a dispute over states' rights. Generations of Americans learned a version of history that really obscured slavery's central role. And the Lost Cause became one of the most successful historical myths ever created. By the end of the 19th century, the Lost Cause dominated the Southern story of the Civil War, not because it fit the evidence, but because it was backed by institutions and violence. During Reconstruction, white paramilitary groups and mobs murdered office holders, broke up meetings, threatened black voters. At Colfax, Louisiana in 1873, while attackers killed scores of African Americans after a disputed election. That happened there. Terror, white terror, made resistance life-threatening. Black Southerners still organized through churches, through schools, newspapers, politics, and migration. But where killers acted with little fear of punishment, violence silenced witnesses. It emptied polling places and helped white redeemers, as they called themselves, seize the governments that controlled public schools and public places. We're going to look at that in the next episode, or the next couple of episodes, actually. At the same time, all this is going on. The Lost Cause is rising. The black people in the South are getting quieter because of the white terrorism, the oppression that's going on. And as this is all going on, the North is just getting tired. The Panic of 1873, the economic panic, the pursuit of industrial growth, new fortunes, it crowded Reconstruction out of national attention. Many Northern leaders dreaded anything that looked like another sectional war. The disputed elections of 1876, as we'll see in this later episode, it ended in a bargain that put Rutherford B. Hayes in the White House and removed federal troops from Southern state houses. Then the Supreme Court narrowed Reconstruction's projections and their protections by striking down much of the Civil Rights Act of 1875 in 1883, and it approved this separate but equal doctrine in 1896 through Plessy versus Ferguson. The amendments, they survived, the constitutional amendments of equality and freedom. They survived on paper, but the will to enforce them was no longer there. Into that vacuum stepped the makers of memory. Veterans groups, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, textbook committees, ministers, politicians. They repeated this consoling story until it sounded like common sense. When Richmond unveiled its statue of Robert E. Lee in 1890, an estimated 100,000 people filled the streets. A child could hear the Lost Cause in a classroom. They watched it performed at a reunion. They could see it cast in bronze on the courthouse lawn. That was the political power that was becoming permanent. And the process reached a cruel clarity in 1898. In November of that year, armed white supremacists in Wilmington, North Carolina, they burned a black newspaper. They killed black residents, and they drove a lawfully elected biracial government from office. 1 month later, fresh from victory over Spain, President William McKinley told Georgia's legislature, within the context of what had just happened in North Carolina, he said sectional lines no longer mar the map of the United States. He called every Civil War grave a tribute to American valor, and he proposed federal care for Confederate graves. The reunion he celebrated rested on a pretty terrible bargain. White Northerners and Southerners would praise courage on both sides. They would stop arguing about slavery and turn toward industry. They would turn towards empire. They would turn towards profit. And black citizenship would be the cost. That's what would pay the price. So the lost cause won the contest over the memory of the Civil War. The white South controlled the ballot box, the school book, and the public square. Much of the North accepted reunion in exchange for just forgetting. But black families, churches, journalists, and activists, they preserved another memory, a memory about emancipation, about citizenship, and about promises betrayed. Ida B. Wells, who we'll meet in a later episode, gave that work its lasting instruction. Wells wrote, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." The lost cause was not harmless nostalgia. It wasn't just another interpretation of history. It was the story that helped a defeated Confederacy win the peace. I'm J.B. Shreve, and you're listening to our podcast series, The Empire, a 250-year American story. We'll be back with another installment in this series in the coming days. For now, thanks for listening to the End of History podcast, where we help believers make sense of the chaotic world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that made those times.